And so I've just gone and created a new material graph, and how I've done that is I've just gone up to File, New Substance. I made sure that we selected Physically Based, and I set our size mode to relative to parent with a width of 2048 by 2048. Now if you accidentally hit absolute in your creating your new substance, don't worry. You can just come down into your graph and double click anywhere on the graph, and we can just come up to this little guy here and we can just set it to relative to parent. And this just allows us to change our parent size of our texture on the fly. I just want to add a base material because this is going to be our kind of viewer, or our way to basically take a look at our material on our 3D mesh here. So to set it up, I like to take a dielectric material preset, and I also like to go down to our user-defined maps and allow the input of our normal and our height. So if I take a normal map and I just plug this guy in, and I right click on our base material and view in 3D, we're going to get our viewer working how we want to visualize our geometry here. So the first thing I want to do is go about creating the ribs of the cactus, or kind of the banding or rectangular features that are going to stretch along the cactus here. And so what I'm going to do is take a gradient linear 3 node from our selection here. And if you don't have a gradient linear 3, you can also just use a gradient linear 2. It will give you relatively the same effect. But I'm going to choose 3. And I'm going to use this as our kind of ribbing effect. Now I want our ribbing to be up and down, not left to right. And so what we can do is just take a rotation down here and switch that to 90. And I'm going to plug this guy into our normal and our height, and you're not going to get much of an effect, and that's because we have one large texture just kind of wrapping around our sphere here. So I'm going to take our linear 3 and I'm just going to tile that right up to 16, and so now we're going to get a little bit of a accordion looking effect. I also want to make sure that I want to turn our normals up to around 4. And it's going to look pretty sharp, but we're going to go about fixing that once we get later down in our geometry pipeline here. So I'm going to bring this guy back. And now I want to create kind of the bumpy or like rounded edging of our ribs here. And so how I'm going to do that is I'm going to create a shape node, and I'm going to select a paraboloid. And this is going to be the basis of our geometry, where we're going to kind of stretch and warp it a little bit to get the kind of elongated roundedness that we want. And so on our shape node here, I'm just going to create a transformation 2D, and I'm going to set the width down to, say, about 50%. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a blend on top of our gradient here, and I'm going to put this guy right over top. And I just want to set the blending mode to screen so that I'm going to be able to see our rounded paraboloids over top of our gradient here while we're finagling around. So I'm going to double click on our blend, and I'll single click on our transformation to alter it. And I'm just going to have our paraboloid here so that we get relatively small and tiled paraboloids that are stretched, and we're going to get them kind of over top of our gradient here like that. And so I think that's just a little too big. So I'm going to just have it one more time. And so something like that along the ridges is kind of the size and the effect that I want to go for this material. So now we run into the issue of, well, we've got some bumps kind of in the crevices in between our ribs, and we don't want that. So how we're going to go about doing that is, or getting rid of those, is by creating a mask. And so the mask that we're going to do is relatively similar to what we've created here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a levels node, and I'm going to run our ribbing right through the levels, and I'm going to crank up the white value so that we start to get a mask. I'm also going to bring up the black just a little bit to separate everything, and I'm going to take this levels node and plug it into our blend. And so now we're going to see what effect this is going to have. And so you can see that the black is cutting right through the crevice or in between bumps, but it hasn't eliminated them entirely. And so what I'm going to do is take away some of our white value, bump up some of our black value, just so that we get a little bit of cutoff. And again, make sure not to invert our mask. And something like that. So now we're only getting our bumps on top of our ribs. And so if we take a little bit of a closer look at our ribbing here, you can see that because of the gradient linear 3, we're getting a little bit of a sharper edge to it. And we don't really want to have a nice sharp edge. And so what we're going to do is just along our pipeline here, we're going to add a bit of a blur. And we're going to blur high quality grayscale. And perfect, that's exactly what I wanted. No, we're going to go down to our intensity here. And we're just going to drag that guy down just so that our two kind of geometries here start to blend together a little bit so that they don't look like they're just sitting on top of each other. And we'll make sure we add the quality to 1. And I generally try and get just the look where it starts to become more visible that they are two different geometries, and I kind of just leave it right there so that you get a little bit of definition. And you can see if we take a look at the profile, we get some nice rounded edges, and if we take a look at it straight on, again you can see that this is a ribbed material and you get some nice bumps. And so I'm just going to take all these guys here and I'm going to add a bracket around them, and I'm going to call this Geo. And that's going to be short for geometry because this is the basis of our cactus that we're going to be building upon. So now that we've got our base geometry created, I want to go and create the little prickles or the little thistles that we get on our cactus here. And so the way that I'm going to go about doing that is I'm going to create another shape node, and we're going to go down and look for paraboloid once again. And the way that we're going to construct our thistles is we're going to drastically decrease the X scale so that we get a nice sharp little thistle looking geometry here. And so something around 0.14 works. And now I'm going to use a splatter circular to kind of throw our geometry around, or our thistle around, so that we get that star looking effect. And so I'm going to make sure that we plug this guy into the pattern 1 input. And we want to make sure that we have our pattern showing up, so we come down to pattern and image input. And now we're going to get our little thistles kind of, well, splattered around in a circle. And so I want to decrease this down to something like 5 so that we get a little bit more of a star formation here. And I also want to increase the ring amount because we want to kind of increase the size of our thistles here, the length of our thistles. So if I come down and I take a look at our size patterns down here as well, I'm just going to kind of stretch these thistles out a little bit more, and something around 0.25 for each I found has worked. So we get our thistles coming out, poking out, and we also get a little bit of like a nest for the thistles to kind of sit on. Nest, that, I don't know, do thistles come from nests? And so now that we've got the base for our thistles or our prickles, we're going to go ahead and just kind of warp them around a little bit so that they're not so straight. And so on top of our splatter, I'm going to add a warp. And I'm just going to use a purlin noise as our input, or our gradient input. So if we double click on our warp here, you can see that it's kind of does a bit of a number on it, and if we bring down our intensity here, we're going to get a little bit of a nicer effect. And again, you can play around with the scale. Maybe bring it down, change the disorder or just the randomness. And just playing a little bit more with intensity, but I think I kind of like it around there. So now we've got the bases of our thistle here. And so now we need to be able to tile it along our ribbed sections. So what I'm going to do is add another tile generator on top of our warp. Again, making sure that we put it into the pattern input. And we come down and select our pattern as image input. So now that we're going to get our thistles just kind of lining up, and you can see that we're getting our nice little warping effect as well. And now we want to make sure that we line it up to the number of ribs that we have. And so if we come down to our gradient here, because we have it tiling 16 times along our x-axis or horizontally, we want to make sure that we have our x-axis reflecting kind of what our gradient or our base is. So we want to make sure that we set this to 16 along our x, so there's going to be 16 along the horizontal axis here. With our y amount, we want to make sure that we scale it up a little bit just so that our thistles aren't getting stretched vertically. So I did something around 18 so that they get some nice, smaller looking thistles, and they're very abundant on top of our cactus here. So now what I want to do is I want to blend these two together so that we get our thistles over top of our geometry here. And so if I create a blend, I'll make sure to put our geometry blend in the bottom or the background input, and I'll take our thistles here and just throw them in over top. And we want to make sure that we go down to our screen blend mode, and now you can see once we get rid of the black that our thistles do not line up. So we have 16 along the horizontal axis, but they don't line up with the ribs. So what I'm going to do is on top of our tile generator, just add a safe transformation grayscale node and make sure that we're viewing by double clicking our blend and single clicking on our transformation node here, that we just offset it on the x-axis. So if we scrub through here, you can see that a value of 0.03 centers us directly on these ribs. And if we take a look at the edge here and hit spacebar, you can see that we're getting a seamless texture. So I'll just bring these guys back, and I'm going to replace our previous blend with this one right here so that we can see. And it's starting to look relatively like a cactus. Now the big issue that we can see here is it looks very, very manufactured, very, very man-made. And so what we're going to do to fix that is come back to our tile generator here, where we've created all of these tiles. And we want to make sure that we just kind of play around a little bit with some of the parameters here. And so with scale random, I want to bring that up just slightly so that we get just a bit of variation in our random scale. And as well, with our position random, I just want to bring our Y random up just a little bit. Again, not touching the X random, because we start to create a little bit of a problem that we circumvented with our safe transform. And now looking at our Y tiling, I don't like how it's kinda in between our bumps here. So I'm going to come back up and I'm just going to bring our Y amount. I'll bring it down to, let's say 16 as well. Nope. 17? We'll do something like 17. And the last thing that I want to do is I just want to add a blur onto our thistles here, because we're getting very large geometry pieces that we don't really want to have, because thistles are going to be relatively close to the cactus. So I'm just going to add a blur effect onto this guy here and really bring down the intensity to something like 0.3. And now we're starting to get a nice looking cactus material here. And so for the next little bit of the tutorial, we're actually going to cheat a little and use some of the same graph nodes or the same links that we've created in the Pincushion tutorial. So if you guys haven't checked it out, I'll link it for you. And make sure to check in the description where I've time-stamped all of the appropriate areas where we go about creating these node connections. So the first thing that we want to do is create the thread in between each one of our ribs here. And so I'm going to come up to our tomato that we've created in a previous tutorial, and we've got our threads and our mask right here. So what I'm going to do is just highlight all of these and hit Control-C on my keyboard, and I'm going to come back to our graph here. If we view in 3D, I'm going to select on our graph and hit Control-V, and it's going to copy and paste all of the graph nodes that we've selected here. And so if I bring these up here, you can see that we're getting our mask for our threads here. Now the problem is, if we take a look, these aren't lined up in the appropriate spots to where we want to intersect them in between. So if we come back to our tile generator here, we just have to make sure that we bump this up to 16. So now if we take a look here, we should be getting 16 different threads. So if I blend these together, and we put this guy on top and this guy underneath, and we go down to screen, you can see that we're going to get our thread right in the center of our ribs here. So just to fix that, I'm going to come down to our Safe Transform node, and I'm just going to hit delete, because we don't need to offset our thread here, and it will just fall naturally in between each one of our ribs. And so if we blend this guy and bring him into our height and our normal map here, you can see now we're starting to get our ribs in between, or our threads in between our ribs here. Now we run into the issue of the geometry where it's very, very pointy because we have a dark area, and then this is very white, so it's going to jag right out again. In order to fix that, all I'm going to do is add a levels node at the end of our threads here. And I'm just going to make sure that the white value is very far down, just so that it's almost black, just a little bit. And that's still a little bit pointy, so I'm going to bring that down a little bit more, just so that we get a very, very off black or very dark gray. And so now we've got our threads right in between all of our ribs here. And so now we want to go about creating the stitching pattern that we're going to use to give this the look that it is more of a knit or a sewn material. And so how to do that is we're going to create a Fibers.2, and I'm just going to hit Control D and we're going to duplicate it. And we're going to have these two kind of intersecting and weaving with each other. So for the top one, I want to make this tile about 13 times. And you can see that we get this, nice smaller tiling. And for the Fibers.2, I want to just crank this all the way up to 16. And it's just going to be a little bit smaller if we compare the two here. On the bottom one here, I want to add a Safe Transform grayscale, because we want to turn this on a 90 degree so that we've got perpendicular going fabrics here. So I'm going to blend those two together, putting this guy in the foreground. I'm going to come down to screen so that it's going to remove any black or darker values from the top one and overlay it on top of our bottom texture. And so it's going to give us this knit looking material here. And so if we blend these two together, we can just see what kind of effect it's going to give us. And if I go down to screen, if I go down to multiply, sorry, you can see that looks kind of funky. And that's because we've got these huge knit patterns going across. And so now in order to bring this down to a more manageable size with our knits, we're going to use a make it tile photo, or sorry, a make it tile patch, and make sure that we select the grayscale one because we're working with grayscale images. And you can see now what this has done is it's basically just kind of tiled it and made it a little bit smaller. Another thing I want to note is that we should always, when working with such noisy geometry or noisy details, plug in that just to our normals. And you can see I've already gone ahead and done that, because if we plug both this into our normals and our height, we get very, very noisy looking geometry here. And so there's two ways we can go about doing this. We can add a levels node right at the end here like we've done before and try and find the sweet spot on our material here and get a little bit of height detail, or we can just plug in our cleaner looking height map and just use the rest of it as a normal map. And so to save a node, I'm just going to plug in our cleaner, more smooth and gradiated geometry here and leave the noisier stuff for just our normal map. And so if we come back to our make it tile patch node here, I'm going to come down and we're going to have a lot of options. And so what I want to do is I want to increase the width and the height here, and we're going to use the octave to really bring on the stitching and the fabric looking illusion here, or the effect. But now I run into the problem of having our stars pretty much non-existent and kind of making a bit of a mess with our threads here. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mask them off. And we've already created masks for these. We just need to blend them together. You can see that we've got our thread mask here, and we've got our star, our thistle mask right here. So I'm going to add a blend, and I'm going to take our threads and put them on top. And I'm going to take our thistles at the safe transform here, and I'm going to plug this into our bottom. And just make sure that I hit screen. And now we've got a mask that we can use to mask off the stars and our threads. So I'll bring this guy down here, and I will plug it in. And because we've got our white showing up as our stars or our thistles and our threads here, we need to invert it. So I'm just going to bring this guy back and add an invert grayscale. And now you can see that we've got both our thistles and our threads showing up with the rest of the material here. And so now that we've got our geometry all completed, I'm going to go ahead and erase our base material here. And I'm just going to start plugging in all of our appropriate nodes. And so with everything input, I'm going to just right click and view outputs in 3D. And now we're going to go back to our very reflective black sphere. And so just to visualize things better, I'm going to add a color node into our roughness here. Select grayscale, and I'm just going to bring it up halfway, just so that we're better able to see the geometry that we're working with here. So now that we've got all of our material situated, I'm going to start by working on the albedo map. And what I want to do is break into layers the different materials and the different texture sets that we have versus the thread, the fabric, and the thistles here, and kind of work on them independently of each other. And so the first thing that I want to do is I want to start by creating a base green color that we're going to use as kind of the foundation of what we're doing. And so I'm going to add a color node, and I'm just going to plug it right into our output here. And I'm going to come up and I'm just going to select a nice kind of darkish green, darkish but lime kind of green. And again, we can edit this later. So I want to start by creating a nice yellowish tinge on top at the kind of the edges or the ridges of our ribs here, because if you take a look at one of the circular cactuses, or pretty much any cactus, they start to fade away from the sun and kind of discolor towards the top. So we need to mask off this kind of portion of the material. And so again, we've got our stars, but we don't actually have any good blend of just the top portion. So what we can use is this guy right here. And if we run it through a levels node, we can kind of take away and detract some of the blacker values so that we only get the tippy tops of our ribs here. And so if we take this guy and run it through a gradient map, we just want to make sure that the white values that we have are a little bit more of a yellowish tinge. And again, it's going to be a bit of an off-white to yellowy bronze kind of area. And so if we blend these two together, making sure that our base color is at the bottom, and throw this over top, we can just use this as a mask. And you can see now we're getting that little bit of fading because we want it to fade in and not just be yellow or worn and then green. And so we get a little bit of a gradient by using this as a mask. And now that I can see this in our view, I want to just come back and change the green a little bit to maybe something a little bit lighter, something like that. And so now that we've got kind of the edges of the outer surface of our material, I want to kind of come in and color each of the thistles. And like we did by masking off the other one, I want to come in and just mask off our thistles. And we've already made a mask by creating a tile generator of all of these thistles. And so I'm just going to add a gradient map and bring this guy, our safe transform, and just plug that guy right in. And so now in our color selector here, I'm going to make sure that all of our white values are just a nice yellowish tint. And again, if you want to add a little bit of non-uniform color, we can go and play around with our scale a little bit. And so something like that looks pretty cool. And so now over top of our chain here, I'm going to add another blend. And I'm going to plug this guy in over top. And like we did with our previous chain here, we're just going to use this as a mask so that we've got them coming on over top. And that's looking pretty good. Now I want to focus in on our threads here, because right now they're just the same color as our base cactus, and that doesn't look exactly right because we wouldn't really use the same thread. It would be a little bit more artistic and a little bit of an off greenish color. So like we've been doing before, we just want to find where we have this masked off, and we're going to use this as both our color gradient and our mask. So if I add another gradient map and plug this guy in here, we want to go and color this guy a little bit of a turquoise, greenish blue. And if I add a blend to our chain, and use both the mask as a mask and a gradient, you can see now we're starting to get a different colored thread here. So now I'm going to come around and just play with this color a little bit, make sure that we see more blue and less black, and maybe I want to do something like a red stitch instead. And here, this gives you the full control of creating any color that you want for any of these different materials that we've created. And so for our albedo, that's looking pretty good. At the end of our base color here, I just want to add a sharpen node just to sharpen everything up a little bit. And you can see that it really makes these thistles stand out a lot. And we just want to bring this down just a little bit, just so that we get some nice color contrast and that things don't all blend into one another. So now if I start working my way down to our roughness, I'm going to go ahead and delete this uniform color node. And I'm going to, in its place, add a curvature smooth node, which we're going to take the input from the normal map. And you can see that we get this nice looking grayscale image that finds kind of all the edges of our material here. And now the problem with this is that white values indicate rough while black values indicate glossy. And if we take a look, you can see that the black values are in between our threads and our fabrics here, which wouldn't make a lot of sense because this would be read as the glossiest part of our material. So I'm just going to add an invert grayscale, and I'm just going to run that through. And now you can see that it's inverted all of our color values to make more sense when being read by our roughness output here. And if I plug that guy in, you can see there really isn't a lot of glossiness to it. And so when we come down to our metallic here, I'm just going to add a uniform color input, and I'm going to go over and select grayscale. I'm also going to just decrease the size of this texture because we don't need it to be 2048 by 2048, as there's no actual metal values here. So this is just going to be a waste of a resource when trying to load a 2K black texture. So I'm going to come up to our output size when selected on our uniform color here and hit absolute. And I'm just going to bring it down to 16 by 16 pixels. So a very, very small texture set. And this is just going to be our metallic map here. On our height as well, because we want some control of how high our material is here, I'm going to add a histogram range. If we bring this guy down, we can start to see what this does. So it has two parameters down here, the position and the range. And so what the range does is either decreases the contrast of the black and white values or increases the contrast, or values that are significantly different from each other. And if we take a look here, increasing the range makes the darkers dark and the whiters white, and decreasing it kind of decontrasts everything. The position takes whichever range you have selected and just kind of makes it all uniformly darker or uniformly brighter. And this allows you to find a nice range for your heights and just shift it all together without having to accidentally shift a range or decontrast a range, and it lets you find a range that you like and just work with that. So I'm going to keep the range at about 0.5. And I'm going to bring our position up to 0.06 or 0.6 because nothing seems to be peaking. And if we take a look here, things are relatively close to white, but nothing is a pure white. And if we take a look here, nothing seems to be flat. And it's a nice distance off of the cactus. Lastly, we want to include our ambient occlusion output. And so if we come down here into output, we want to make sure that we add an item and find ambient occlusion in our drop down here. I'm just going to call this ambient occlusion. and then label it ambient occlusion. And lastly, we want to make sure that it is in the material group, just in case we use this elsewhere, and it makes selection so much easier. So I'm going to add an ambient occlusion node, and I'll plug this guy right in, and I'm going to find our height. And so if I bring this guy down and we take a look at the normal map, you can see that we start to get in between the stitches. Now I want to make sure in our ambient occlusion node here that we set GPU optimization to greatly reduce the milliseconds that it takes to load this node. And I also want to bring down our height depth so that it's not as dark. I also want to bring down our radius so that we don't get as sharp of a occlusion, and something like that I think is going to work. So if we just right click anywhere in our graph and view outputs in 3D, now we're going to start to see our ambient occlusion work.